Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. Welcome to my channel. My name is Ogbanje Joseph. Please subscribe to this channel, share, like, as well as drop a comment on the comment section. So, our lecture today is titled The Relationship Between Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. Relationship between diplomacy and foreign policy. Now, the interests of nation states are articulated taking many factors into consideration. Such factors like economic needs and resources, geography, defense requirements and strategies, existing alliances with other states, and many factors in foreign policy are taken into consideration. However, the success of foreign policy of any nation depends on the nature of diplomacy. It could be said that while foreign policy is concerned with substance and content of external relations across the national boundary, diplomacy is primarily concerned with the methodology for implementing the foreign policy objectives of a nation state. Now, let us look at the nature of diplomacy. Now, what is the nature of diplomacy? A diplomat's words must have no relation to actions. Otherwise, what kind of diplomacy is it? Words are one thing, actions are another. Good words are a mask for concealment of bad deeds. Sincere diplomacy is no more possible than dry water or wooden iron. That is actually, the quotation from Joseph Stalin. Now, Joseph Stalin in this quotation expressed the traditional attitude of modern dictators towards diplomacy, namely that it is a means of concealing a nation's real aims and of providing a smooth screen for actions of vastly different character. Joseph Stalin, in short, took a cynical view of the art of diplomacy. While the sentiments of Stalin have some justifications, they do not suggest the real nature of diplomacy, which consists of the techniques and procedures, for conducting relations among states. Now, diplomacy is in fact the normal means of conducting international relations. Now, in itself, diplomacy, like any machinery, is both neither moral nor immoral. Its use and value depends upon the intentions and ability of those who practice it. Okay? Now, diplomatic function through a labyrinth of foreign offices, embassies, legations, consulates, and special missions all over the world is commonly bilateral in character, but as a result of the growing importance of international conferences, international organizations, regional arrangements, and collective security measures, its multilateral aspect has become interestingly significant. It may embrace a multitude of interests, from the simplest matter of detail in the relations between two states, to vital issues of war and peace. When it breaks down, the danger of war, or at least a major crisis, is real. Now, nation states deal bilaterally with one another and meet together in multilateral organization, not only because they have interest in common, but also, because they have interest, which is to avoid conflict. Moreover, the fact of dependence breeds suspicion and doubts. History is full of examples of conflict, duplicity, and reversals of policy, and everyday fresh examples are emerging. Diplomacy is intimately concerned with these problems and is therefore viewed as an organized pattern of communication and negotiation, which enables each independent state, to learn from what is also objects, for what it also objects to. In modern international societies, diplomacy has become more than an instrument of communication and bargaining. It is an activity which, even if often abused, has a bias towards the resolution of conflicts. Some leading diplomats and specialists have used the word diplomacy as the practice of international legal principles and norms in international relations. Diplomacy, with its ever increasing intricate techniques, in all fields of human activity in contemporary period, has transformed itself into a well-organized scientific discipline, and its effectiveness in international politics cannot be overemphasized. Now, let us look at the relationship between foreign policy and diplomacy. It is necessary to bear in mind that there is a defined distinction between foreign policy and diplomacy. The foreign policy of a state, according to Charles 1948, is the substance of foreign relations, whereas diplomacy is the process by which foreign policy is carried out. Policy is made by different persons and agencies, but presumably on major matters in any state, whatever its form of government, it is made of the highest levels, though subject to many different kinds of control. Then it is the purpose of diplomacy to provide the machinery and the personnel by which foreign policy is executed. One is substance, the other is method. So while foreign policy is the substance, diplomacy is actually the method. Okay. Now let us look at one of the most astute students and practitioners of diplomacy in the 20th century, Harold Nicolson, is particularly insistent on calling attention to this distinction. However, in some cases, his efforts to be very precise in this matter seem to raise further questions. For example, in his interesting study, The Congress of Vienna, a study in Allied unity, published in 1964, Nicholson wrote, "It is useful, even when dealing with a remote historic episode, to consider where diplomacy ends and foreign policy, and of course foreign policy begins." Let me take it again. That it is useful even when dealing with a remote historical episode, to consider where diplomacy ends and foreign policy begins. Each of them is with the adjustment of national, to international interest. Foreign policy is based upon a general conception of national requirements. Diplomacy, on the other hand, is not an end but a means, not a purpose but a method. It seeks, by the use of reason, conciliation and exchange of interest, to proven major conflicts arising between sovereign states. It seeks, by the agencies through which foreign policy seeks, to attain its purpose, by agreement rather than by war. Thus, when agreement becomes impossible, diplomacy, which is the instrument of peace, becomes inoperative, and foreign policy, the final sanction of which is war, alone becomes operative. The last sentence of the above quotations, tends to destroy the nice distinction between diplomacy and foreign policy which Nicholson has made. And it is misleading in that it suggests that diplomacy ceases to function when major international wars arise, especially if they lead to war. The object of diplomacy as of foreign policy is to protect the security of a nation by peaceful means, if possible, but by giving every assistance, to the military operation if war cannot be avoided. Diplomacy does not cease, to function, as Nicholson suggests, in time of war, although it necessarily plays a different role. In wartime, the work of diplomats, as of foreign ministers, may even expand. The diplomacy of the two world wars of this century, provides convincing, support for contention. Diplomatic agents play significant role in the formulation of foreign policy, particularly through periodic reports which they send to the foreign office relating to the affairs and interests of the sending states in the countries to which they are accredited. These reports become input of raw materials through which foreign policy is formulated. The importance of diplomacy and diplomatic agents in the formulation of foreign policy is pointed out by Francois de Calais, who says that while the final responsibility for all success or failure in diplomacy would seem to rest upon the king and his ministers at home, it is nonetheless true that since these ministers can only act upon information from abroad, the influence which an enlightened diplomat can exercise upon the actions and design of the home government is very large. Therefore, the responsibility of diplomatic action is in reality shared in about equal degree between the home government and its servants abroad. Okay, so what the above quotation suggests is that for a state to succeed in its relations with other states, a sound and harmonious combination of competent diplomacy and pragmatic foreign policy is actually very necessary. Thank you very much.